Planet Profit so that we're all speaking with the same voice, giving the same message. The secret is that we're paying for it right now. It's just not visible. It's not obvious to us how we're paying for it. But again, we're paying for it in rates. We're paying for it in fees. We're paying for it in health consequences. We're paying for it right now.
So even if people say it's not my profession, it's not what I deal with on a day-to-day basis,
if
you're living in this world, you're dealing with it in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely, Chuck.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I think it's so eminent on the news. I mean, you're looking at what's going on in California. You're looking at what's going on with rising seawaters in New York. I mean, these are cities that we've either all visited or that we know of. You know, Detroit also lives on the water. Detroit has a lot of natural resources that are here. We're lucky enough to have the quantity of fresh water that we have in Michigan and surrounding us. But the more, to Carla's point, the more versed you are on the topic, and maybe this is also, I'm a big believer in starting young. Maybe this is about educating.
People have come to appreciate President George H.W. Bush is not only his achievements in office, but that the virtues that he had, which were so consonant with the man. You know, a lot of people have noted he was born into privilege, Yale, and so forth. But what's less often noted is that the privilege of his generation came with obligations. And I think there's no more moving story than to read when he was still in high school and his uncle, the senator, and the Secretary of War were saying, stay in school. When the war broke out, you know, don't do anything, get your college degree. On his 18th birthday, he signed up for the United States Navy and was at one point the youngest pilot in the Navy. So this was a man that understood honor and obligation, and I think that defined him.
More on that, Marianne. You know, he was in the Navy, was shot down, and survived the shoot down, rescued by an American submarine, went on to fly more combat missions. Then he married Barbara, and at one point he, after graduating from Yale in just 2.5 years, he was apparently thinking about applying for a Rhodes Scholarship, but decided he could not afford to support his wife and his young child, George, the future president. And so he decided not to do that. But again, he came from family money. The family had a lot of money, but he wasn't going to tap into that.
Well, I think it speaks volumes about his strength, and much has been made by everybody in these last 48 hours about the kindness and decency of George H.W. Bush. But he was also a very strong person, and he proved you can be kind and decent and strong. Surviving your plane getting shot out of the sky into the ocean as a young man, you have to be strong. To run multiple political campaigns for many offices, run and win some, run and lose some, get back up and do it again. To run for president is a grueling marathon, and yet he did that twice. And I would say the end of the Cold War and taking down the Berlin Wall, that took great strength not to give a speech, not to tout the role of the United States in it. So it allowed the reunification of Germany to proceed with peace. And you can see that in Angela Merkel's comments in English the other day, a rare thing by her, and the fact that she's attending his funeral. And last but not least, to forge a friendship with Bill Clinton, the man who defeated him after one term. They put together a friendship, traveling the world, trying to help people get back on their feet and do good things. And it's a friendship that Bill Clinton, I think, cherishes more than any other. And I think that says everything about George Bush and his length of service, his character of kindness and decency, but as a very strong man, too. Not someone who touted his strength. He didn't talk about it. He didn't beat his chest, but his actions proved it every day.
Well, you're looking live at the motorcade as it makes its way to Ellington Field in Houston, where our own Rick Leventhal is standing by. Rick?
Ellington Field is a joint reserve base hosted by the Texas Air National Guard, and today it's hosting Air Force One, which has been redubbed Special Air Mission 41 for this honor today to carry the body of George H.W. Bush from here in Texas to Washington, D.C. It took us a while to get through security here. There's a lot of press on a riser, and there are a lot of friends and family and well-wishers who are gathering here as well, passing through that security line to wait here for the family, for those buses to arrive with the family members on board. And there will be military honors here and a departure ceremony here before George H.W. Bush is on Air Force One, of course, now Special Air Mission 41 for that 3.5-hour flight back to Washington. We can tell you that it's an honor for the folks here in Texas to be handling this, and we have been told that there will in fact be a 21-gun salute. And ruffles and flourishes and Hail to the Chief will be played here. We've seen the band out here setting up and getting ready. We've also seen a couple of photographs via Twitter from the presidential spokesman, Jim McGrath, who posted not just that now very famous photo of Sully, the service dog that had been with President George H.W. Bush in his final months and days. Sully lying in front of the president's casket. Sully will also be on the plane when it leaves here today and will be given to another war veteran's family at Walter Reed. McGrath also tweeted a picture of the socks that the president will be wearing. Of course, he loved his socks, and the socks that he's wearing will pay tribute to his lifetime of service, starting as an 18-year-old naval aviator. Of course, he flew 58 combat missions in World War II. Those socks feature images of 6 jets and smoke trails. So that's what the president will be wearing. We know that the ceremony here will be relatively brief, and then they'll board the jet, and they will take off from here, I believe in less than an hour, about an hour from now. We're about 36 miles from that funeral home, so it's taken about 40 minutes to get here. Then the ceremony will take place, and then they'll head off into the sky.
As we await that ceremony on the tarmac there at Ellington Field, we thank you.
Let's get some thoughts from our Fox News senior political analyst, Brit Hume, joins us now. Brit, you've been quite eloquent, as usual, in your memories of President George H.W. Bush. Give us your final thoughts this morning.
Well, I want to pick up on something Marianne Marsh was talking about when she spoke of the president's strength. And what I remember so vividly, John, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the president reacted rather mildly at first, and then as the days wore on, his reactions became stronger and sterner. And I remember the day that he said of the invasion, "This will not stand." And it took my breath away at the time. I thought, how is he going to bring that about? And he did. And what happened during that period, John, was so interesting because he was faulted often for being sort of bumblingly inarticulate and not terribly eloquent. And, of course, he had a tough act to follow in Ronald Reagan. But for a period of time, he seemed a man transformed. His public statements to the media were very carefully stated, crisp, articulate, firm, and precise. And if you followed them, as I had to, because I was working that beat, you could see in him a steel that hadn't always been evident. And, of course, as the world now knows, he was able, by virtue of his diplomatic skills and those of, his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, to assemble this remarkably broad coalition of forces. They got resolution approving the use of force to evict Saddam Hussein's army from the United Nations, and that preceded what turned out to be a very close, in some ways, I think, disgracefully close vote in the U.S. Senate to authorize the action. But that was a test of his strength, and it emerged, I think, how much strength he had in him, how much steel, how much resolve, and how much courage, really, because as we talked about earlier, John, sending men and women into battle is a painful experience for a president, and something he had to do and did. Fortunately, of course, the war went well, and the casualties were few.
He knew very well the costs of service and sacrifice. Some of his crew members did not survive the shoot-down of that plane that he survived in World War II. So
something he said he thought about nearly every day.
Mm-hmm. Brit Hume, it's good to talk to you. Brit, thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
Thanks, John.
And meanwhile, we await the departure ceremony. It is about to get underway there at Ellington Field. As we await that, let's bring back in Brad Blakeman for his final thoughts. Brad, after this, then he flies to Washington, and the Capitol Rotunda awaits him.
Exactly, and it'll be a time for the Congress to pay their respects to the president, and also a time for the public. We'll have public viewing around the clock tonight, on Tuesday, and then it will end around 7:30 Wednesday. So we're going to be able to accommodate many thousands of Americans to pay their respects. But I remember quite vividly President Bush telling us as his staff that no life is complete without service. You can run for office, you can volunteer at a hospital, everybody can do something. And his life is an example of that. And we should remember that no life should be complete without giving something back. And there's no greater example than the example that 41 has left for us.
Brad Blakeman, thank you.
Thank you.
Bill McGurn and Marianne Marsh continue with us. Bill, in your work with the Bush family, I mean, this is obviously, they're often described as a political dynasty, but you can't help from the outside looking in, just thinking that these are, well, it's a very close family filled with people who really love each other.
Absolutely. You know, sometimes when someone's famous, when there's a story about what they're really like in private life, it's very disappointing that the reality doesn't match to the hype. With George H.W. Bush, it was the opposite. Every private act that he did seemed to be about service to someone else. I remember when he shaved his head because one of the children of a Secret Service agent on his detail was going through some illness, and so in solidarity he did that. And I think there are hundreds of stories like that. I didn't know him very well. I knew his son from working with him, but I met him several times. At one point, my 4-year-old went up to him when he was attending the unveiling of the portrait for his son, and she had a 10-minute conversation with the president. He didn't shoo her away, and I think that there's a lot of stories like that. It's just who he was. The public man was consonant with the private man, and that's an incredible thing to say about a former president.
Bill McGurn and also Marianne Marsh is standing by. Marianne, you heard Britt Hume reflect back on your earlier comments, and really a moment to talk about unity. And this was a president that was able to unify the country, and he is being remembered in that way strongly today.
And deservedly so. I mean, Britt raised yet another point where he showed great strength and great commitment and great steel in his spine. And I think that often got overlooked during George H.W. Bush's life. But I hope in time, as he has always said, that history would judge him. It was not for him to explain or define himself, which is almost unthinkable these days in politics and in life, but he would let others do it. And I hope and I believe that people will appreciate the strength he showed. I think these days, these last 48 hours and the 4 days to come will show the country again what it's like to come to unify, to be bipartisan, to appreciate somebody's service from another party. I mean, believe me, I've worked against both Bushes. In the father in '92 in particular, a worthy opponent every day to the very end of that race. He was a tough, tough competitor, but you can also do good things and do well and do the right thing. And I think this is a wonderful moment, despite its sadness and tragedy, where we have an opportunity to show people that that's how things really should be done and could be done again.
Bill, I remember growing up, you know, duck and cover drills because of the fear of nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. It seemed like an impermeable force. And the fact that you can today travel to a country like Poland, which is such a beautiful country and where they love Americans so much, it was not a foregone conclusion that Poland would one day be free.
And the Berlin Wall would come down, which it did on his watch. And he managed that particularly well. Look, the president's life, if you think of it, 94 years, that's almost a century of American history. And I think a lot of us are thinking we've lost something. There was, you know, it was kind of nice thinking there was this anchor out there in George H.W. Bush, that he was reassuring, confident without being arrogant, and you know, as we've said here, much stronger than he was given credit for. He really was a speak softly and carry a big stick kind of guy, and he spoke very softly, but people that ran up against him, I think, did so at their peril.
You know, talking about steel in his spine, we all remember when he marked his 75th birthday by going skydiving, but then he followed that up on his 80th and his 85th and his 90th birthday skydiving. That takes some mettle and shows you what kind of man he was.
And getting an update from some of our producers here, Fox has confirmed that the eulogist at the National Cathedral for the 41st president will be former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, former Senator Alan Simpson, and presidential historian John Meacham. will be the 4 eulogists at the funeral service again that will take place at the National Cathedral. What you are seeing right now is the very beginning of the ceremonies, several of them, both public and private, over the next couple of days. But first and foremost, the body of the former president will make its way to Air Force One today, Special Air Mission 41, ahead of its departure to Washington, D.C., where his body will lie in state for 2 days so the public can say their final goodbyes. All right. It is the top of a new hour. Thank you for joining us live in America's newsroom. You are looking live at pictures of Houston, Texas, where the former President George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, his body makes its way to Ellington Field, where it will depart to the nation's capital for final goodbyes from the public, as his body will lie in state for 2 days. The 41st President, his family, in that motorcade there as they make their way to Ellington Field, and there will be a departure ceremony. You're about to see honors rendered, 4 ruffles and flourishes, and hail to the chief with a 21-gun salute as an honorable send-off for the 41st President.
I hope you're taking note of the traffic that's pulled over on the other side of the freeway. Houston traffic it's bad pretty much 24 hours a day, but people are pulling over. Even noticed a big rig there just a moment ago that had pulled over to the left side of the oncoming side of the interstate to pay respects to the 41st President as his funeral procession heads by.
And President Trump sent Air Force One down to Ellington Field to carry the casket along with family members. Today it will be Special Air Mission 41, and Rick Leventhal is live at Ellington Field in Houston as you await the family's arrival. Rick?
Yeah, it's about a 36-mile trip from that funeral home here to Ellington Field. So 40 minutes or so, perhaps a little bit more before they get here, the buses and George H.W. Bush and his family members arrive. We've just been given a briefing that they are going to pull that motorcade right up behind us here on the runway, and the hearse will be just down the road from us here a little bit. There will be, as you mentioned, a ceremony when they arrive here, and we will be able to show you the pictures of it, but we won't be talking over that ceremony as the Joint Military Honor Guard helps to remove the casket from the hearse. The family will be here. There are also a lot of friends who have gathered here to pay their respects. The band will play. There will be a 21-gun salute. A hymn will be sang, and they will carry that casket over to Air Force One, which is, you mentioned, has been redubbed Special Air Mission 41 for this. George W. Bush, 43, and his wife will be here as well, along with other family members who will escort George H.W. Bush back to Washington aboard the jet. So we're waiting. It could be sometime in the next 30 minutes or so. I think we're told about 25 minutes from now the motorcade should arrive here. And then the ceremony itself could last 30 to 40 minutes. They're not entirely sure how long exactly, but then sometime just after, I guess it would be noon, just after noon Eastern time, the jet will take off, and the flight lasts about 3.5 hours back to Washington, D.C., guys.
President George W. Bush and grandson George P. Bush are already on site. There will be 4 ruffles, flourishes, hail to the chief, and a 21-gun salute. So we're several minutes out from that. Rick Leventhal on the ground there at Ellington Field. Thank you, Rick.
And a bit of a fitting coda to those of us who are aviation buffs, but the Air Force One aircraft, the 747 that will fly the body of the late president back to Washington as Special Air Mission 41. Those 2 aircraft, there are 2 Air Force One aircraft, if you didn't know. Those 2 aircraft were first placed in service in the first Bush administration. So George H.W. Bush was the first president to fly on board these planes, and they are being retired, as you might know. So this is kind of a fitting coda to his presidency. George Terwilliger was Deputy Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush and later Acting Attorney General at the close of his administration. You worked closely with the man. You've heard some of the memories of those who covered him. But what about working in his administration? Tell us what that was like.
Well, it was a wonderful experience. One of the things I've reflected on over the last couple of days was the quality of the people that President Bush had around him. When I think back on going to meetings at the White House in the Situation Room with Bob Gates as Deputy National Security Advisor chairing the Deputies Committee, of Jim Baker being over at the State Department, Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor, Bill Barr, Attorney General. Just an incredible collection of really talented people, and I think that's one of the things that made his administration work, certainly on the military and national security side. If you look at the success of that first Gulf War, the necessity of that war and the success of it, it was born of people who were dedicated to the country and dedicated to doing the right thing.
George, if you were to sum up his leadership style, his governing style, how would you do that as you look back at his life and his long time in office as a military man, and obviously remembering him as a family man, but he inspired so many as a leader?
He certainly was inspirational as a leader in a different way than Ronald Reagan was, and I think that's one of the lessons of his leadership is everyone has to lead in their own style. There's no single right way to do it. But the person that he was the most essential characteristic of his leadership, in my view, because it shone through in everything he did. And we've heard a lot about his dedication, his service, his concern for others. The idea of compassionate conservatism really was true. But make no mistake about it, he could be tough. He was tough in terms of dealing with the international situation, particularly in the Gulf, but in other things as well, such as Panama. And he was tough domestically. I can tell you that he asked tough questions, and when he was unhappy about something that had occurred, he had no qualms making people aware of it.
He was not an attorney. You were Attorney General, acting Attorney General. What was it like to deal with him on some of the nation's most thorny legal issues?
Well, that's a great question, because there were many difficult legal issues faced by the Department of Justice and by the administration under war powers during the Gulf crisis. We had some domestic issues. If you remember, Saddam Hussein said if we went to war with him, he would unleash the mother of all terrorism expeditions against the United States. I remember specifically talking in the White House about the need, which we did do, to conduct one of the first infrastructure vulnerability assessments of the United States. But through all of that, the president was deferential to lawyers, but asking very, very good questions. One of the things I think, again, that marked his leadership, he wasn't afraid of accepting the expertise of other people, whether it be on the national security side or the domestic side. But at the same time, he was analytic, asked questions, and then made decisions. And that ability to make decisions, to be resolute, was another important quality of his leadership, although based on accepting the opinions and views of experts on some of the more esoteric issues.
George Terwilliger, thank you for joining us this morning.
An honor.
An honor to have you, sir. Thank you. Let's bring in John Roberts at the White House for us this morning. The president's declared a national day of mourning on Wednesday, which is when the National Cathedral funeral will take place. John?
Yes, but there's a lot of ceremonies that will happen before Wednesday morning's funeral as well. And good morning to you, Sandra. First of all, anybody who's planning to visit Washington, D.C. will find that Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House is closed for the next 3 days. And the reason why is because the Bush family will be staying across the street at Blair House during the entire two and a half days, really, of the ceremonies here in Washington. The funeral cortege, by the way, is going to pass right here in front of the White House as President Bush's remains are brought from the Capitol up to the National Cathedral on Wednesday morning for that funeral. Nothing official yet, but it's likely that the president will, at some point, go up to Capitol Hill to pay his respects to President Bush 41 in the Capitol Rotunda. We do know that the Vice President Mike Pence will be speaking at the ceremonies to mark the beginning of the president lying in state. That'll be in the 4 o'clock hour this afternoon, and we will have that, of course, for you live here on Fox. The President and First Lady will be attending the funeral on Wednesday morning at the National Cathedral. Unclear at this point whether the President will speak, but President Trump is not on the official list of people who are giving eulogies. They include George W. Bush, the former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, the former Senator Alan Simpson, who was a very close friend of Bush 41, as well as historian John Meacham. It is unusual, we should say, for a sitting president to not speak at the funeral of a former president, but it's no secret that relations between the president and the Bushes have not exactly been warm. Remember when Barbara Bush passed away some 7 months ago, President Trump did not attend that funeral. The vice president went in his stead. The president did speak, though, to George W. Bush and to Jeb Bush on Saturday morning when he was at the G20 in Argentina, and also praised Bush 41 in a tweet that was released on Saturday morning, saying, quote, President George H.W. Bush led a long, successful, and beautiful life. Whenever I was with him, I saw his absolute joy for life and true pride in his family. His accomplishments were great from beginning to end. He was a truly wonderful man and will be missed by all. You mentioned that the president has invited the nation to join in mourning the passing of President Bush 41, declaring this Wednesday, which is the day of the funeral again, to be a national day of mourning. And I should say, Sandra, that the mood here in Washington, of course, is one of mourning, but also an opportunity to celebrate a great American, a great patriot, and a man who undeniably, whether you talk to a Democrat or a Republican, was a terrific president. His re-election campaign was caught up in the events of that year when the economy started going south, and President Clinton and Vice President Gore made an effective argument that there needed to be a change in terms of the economy, even though the economy was beginning to improve. But let's remember, at one point, President Bush 41's approval ratings after the Iraq War were 90%. And there's not many presidents who ever enjoy an approval rating that high. Sandra?
John, the president's words on Saturday when he was departing Buenos Aires back to Washington, he said, we will be spending 3 days of mourning and 3 days celebrating a really great man's life. He then had Air Force One, or directed Air Force One, to be reset after he returned to Washington and sent down to Houston to carry the former president's casket back to Washington, D.C. John Roberts at the White House for us. John, thank you.
Thanks, Sandra.
Karl Rove served as White House Deputy Chief of Staff for former President George W. Bush. He is also a Fox News contributor. Karl, you obviously played a huge role in getting the son, Bush 43, elected. Talk about the interaction that he had with his father. I mean, this was a rare moment in American history for a father and son both to have served in the Oval Office. What was the interaction like between them that you saw?
Well, a loving father who had been there and knew the difficulties of the job, who knew that a president has to make decisions based on imperfect but a constant flow of information. And so, having been outside that flow of information and now as a former president, he was a supporter of his son, but made no attempt to sort of influence his son one way or the other, because he'd been there. He knew how difficult that job was and how vital it was to, swim in that sea of information and make decisions based on what you knew and how you knew it, rather than just having advice tossed in over the transom, if you will, from a former president. So he was a constant source of support. I know that the unconditional love that he gave all of his children, not only his son, who was the President of the United States, but to all of his children, was a vital part of all of their lives. It was interesting, too, to see them after President Bush 43 left office, because now they had another experience in common, that being the experience of a former president who leaves office, and how do you deal with your role, how do you deal with the rest of your life in that way. And both of them did so with service. President Bush 41 with the 1,000 Points of Light Foundation, with his work with cancer. President Bush 43 obviously with wounded warriors and veterans. So it was interesting to see them both go through that experience.
In the final conversation, Karl, between as you're talking about, Bush 43 and Bush 41. That was his final phone call that his son made to his father. And on that conversation, on the speakerphone, we're told that the son said to his father, "You've been a wonderful father." And George H.W. Bush's response was, "I love you." So those were his final words, and they were to his son. As we start to see the military band gear up for the arrival, Carl, of the Bush family and the casket carrying the 41st president.
Can you imagine at the end of a glorious, long, full life like that, to be able to hear from your children, each one of them, from Doro, from Jeb, from Marvin, from Neil, and your eldest, and to have each one of them thank you for the gift of life and the gift of unconditional love that you gave them, and then to be able to hear your son, your eldest son, say, "You've been a wonderful father, and I love you," and to be able to tell him his final words on this earth, "I love you too." What a glorious end to a fantastic life.
And a fantastic life it was. I mean, I can't, and the more I read about the man, and obviously I experienced his presidency, but the more I read about the man, the more I am in awe of what he accomplished and the way in which he steered his life.
Right. Look, I went to work for him when I was 22 years old. Can you imagine spending most of the next spending 4 years of your life at that age working for a man who has had such extraordinary character and decency and kindness? I mean, it was the formative time of my life, and I know for many others who had the privilege of working with him or for him over the years, they all treasure those moments because they learned what it was like to lead a life. He set a standard of service and dedication and character that you wanted to emulate, knowing full well that you'd fall short, because he was such an extraordinarily, he was not only a very great man, he was a very good man, and it was hard to meet those standards, but you wanted to. And I got a chance in November to go say goodbye to him. They called and said, it's not going to be long, and he'd like you to come and see him. And I got a chance to thank him for all that he meant to me. And I said, "Mr. President, I never understood why," because I met him in August of 1973, and for literally 10 minutes. And 5 or 6 weeks later, I got a phone call saying the chairman, he was the chairman then of the Republican National Committee, I was the chairman of the college Republicans, and his chief of staff called me, Tom Lass, and said, "Chairman Bush would like to know if you'd like to go to work for him." So I got to say to him, "I've never understood why you gave me that opportunity that literally set the arc of the rest of my life." And he had a funny look on his face, and he said, "You seem like a smart young man," and then winked at me. Great sense of humor, and a great joy to work with and work for and to be around.
You described him as a man of extraordinary character, decency, and kindness, and yet he was not reelected. Carl, you know something about how to win an election. Why did that happen?
Well, you know, the times were tough. The campaign ill-served him, in my opinion. It didn't accentuate his strengths, and it didn't act in a deliberate manner that would have helped him win. But look, you know what? He didn't look back. There were a few weeks or months of gloom about having lost, about having let people down. But he went on with his life and had a wonderful several decades after that. And it's a lesson in it. So think about it. He lost a child. His second child died at the age of 3. And Barbara Bush's hair turns white. The two of them are living in West Texas. And what does he do? He picks himself up. They pick themselves up. They have 3 more fantastic children. You know, he loses a race for the U.S. Senate in 1964. What does he do? He picks himself up, runs for the U.S. House of Representatives, is elected as one of 2 Republicans from the state of Texas at that point, and then runs for the U.S. Senate, loses in a tough battle. And what happens? He picks himself up, serves as UN ambassador, serves as chairman of the Republican National Committee, serves as envoy to China, directs the CIA, runs for president, loses out to Ronald Reagan, and what happens? Picks himself up and becomes the vice president of the United States and loyally serves a man for whom he had enormous affection and enormous respect, Ronald Reagan, loyally for 8 years, and then becomes president himself. This is a life in which, you know, nothing was easy in his life. And some of it was deliberately so. 18 years old, turns 18, and the first thing he does to celebrate his birthday is sign up as a Navy aviator to become the youngest pilot in the Navy in World War II. He leaves Yale and has the opportunity to join Brown Brothers Harriman, where his father is a major figure in this prestigious Wall Street firm. And what does he do? He says, I want to go learn the oil business, and I want to head west and start a new life, and starts out as a tool salesman for an oil supply company in Bakersfield, California, then Odessa, Texas, and Midland, Texas. If you ever go to Midland, go see his house, because you'll be shocked how small and modest it is. It's like a cardboard box. And this is what he determined as his life, because he wanted to start fresh and new and build something himself.
You know, as a reminder to everyone, as we await the casket carrying the 41st president, while he's known as the Texas man, he was born in Milton, Massachusetts in 1924. As you mentioned, Carl, he went on to graduate from Yale University, excelled at sports and academics. His military service, though, as you pointed out, Carl, on his 18th birthday, he enlisted in the Armed Forces, U.S. Navy. He flew 58 combat missions during World War II. He was the recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross for bravery in action. In addition to that, he was awarded 3 air medals for his World War II service. He went on to marry Barbara Bush in 1945, and of course, looking back, he saw that as one of his biggest accomplishments. They have 17 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren that came from their 6 children. And you mentioned his oldest daughter, Robin, who died of leukemia in 1953. She was just 4 years old. Karl Rove, thank you for coming on this morning. It's wonderful to hear you look back at his life. I'm going to bring on Judge Andrew Napolitano now. He's Fox News senior judicial analyst. Judge, good to have you this morning as we await the arrival of the 41st president's casket there at Ellington Field.
Well, you know, we all look at presidents differently, and we all see a different thing in them. In me, I see his legacy on the Supreme Court. He appointed 2 members of the court, one of which very much disappointed him, one of which pleased him beyond his imagining. Justice Clarence Thomas has been there for 26 years, whose opinions are now reviewed in case books by law schools as a paradigm of explaining interpretive tools in the Constitution, and who has more former clerks now as federal judges than anybody else on the court. This is a tribute to George H.W. Bush, amidst great controversy and with much resistance even in the Republican Party, choosing then Judge Thomas, going through a very, very tortuous confirmation process and sticking with his nominee.
And that confirmation process for Judge Thomas still echoes today, as we recently saw with now Justice Kavanaugh.
You know, it's unfortunate that these types of confirmations happen once in every generation. It happened to Robert Bork, and he was not confirmed. It happened to Clarence Thomas, and he was confirmed. It happened to Brett Kavanaugh, and he was confirmed. But if you want to get into the weeds a little bit, when George H.W. Bush learned about the allegations against Clarence Thomas, he said, stop everything, send the FBI out to investigate, let them look at everything, and when they're finished with their investigation, we'll resume the confirmation process. And when Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas, she was cross-examined by Arlen Specter, because it turned out she told the FBI a different version than what she told the Senate committee, and he was able to expose that. Why? Because George H.W. Bush had the patience and the big-mindedness of, let's let the FBI do their job. I don't think this is true about the guy I nominated, but I need the FBI to tell me whether it's true or not.
Judge, we are waiting to see the arrival of the hearse carrying Bush 41's casket there in Houston. We await the military band honors will be rendered, a simultaneous 21-gun salute. As we await that, and we talk about our 41st president and his term, and obviously you have a very special way of looking back at him, a very unique perspective. You know, this country is coming together in this moment to bid farewell and watch him make his final departure to Washington, D.C. As this country looks back and remembers our 41st president and his lasting impact on this country.
You know, for some strange reason in the past year or so, I've developed an email relationship with Jeb Bush, his youngest son. And we were emailing each other yesterday, and I said to him, you know, your father was a good man and a great man. These qualities are rarely found in the same human being. He was good not only to those he liked, he was good to people who defeated him and people he disliked. And his greatness came from making courageous decisions in positions of power, nearly always on the side of individual freedom against governmental power. And that's the George H.W. Bush that I remember. Oh, he used to tease me about my height. Everybody teases me about my height. But standing next to George W. Bush, I looked like an infant, George H.W. Bush. So, you know, there was that funny side of him as well. And Barbara would say, stop teasing him about his height. He's smarter than you are. And, you know, you'd have a conversation, a funny conversation like that. But my remembrance of him, those 2 or 3 times I met him, coupled with his legacy in the Supreme Court. You know, the fact that Justice Thomas's opinions are in case books that law students study. Who puts together those case books? The most liberal professors in the United States of America, and they have recognized that George H.W. Bush made the right choice when he put Clarence Thomas on the court, who, by the way, now is the senior member of the court. At 26 years, they are going on 27.
Judge, thank you.
You're welcome.
We are joined once again now by retired 4-star General Jack Keane, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, Fox News senior strategic analyst as well. General Keane, you know, it has been remarked that the coalition to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait was largely put together by this president and the personal relationships that he held with leaders around the globe. That's a remarkable thing, the way that all happened.
Yeah, it certainly is. When you look at this president and you look at his preparation qualifications to be president, I don't think anybody in the 20th century compares to how well prepared and qualified President George H.W. Bush was to ascend to that office after 8 years of vice president, to be sure, but all the other jobs he had in public service and the connections with people around the world. And that certainly manifested itself in an historic 4 years. And certainly most prominent was Saddam Hussein's aggression into the oil fields of Kuwait, and our president's discussion with Margaret Thatcher, and both of them concluding that this will not stand.
General,
we will take action.
The color guard is on the move in Houston, awaiting the funeral procession. We want to listen to this and take in the scene and the sounds as the color guard prepares to welcome the former president and his family. as we look at the members of each branch of the military forces who are part of this color guard for the 41st president. General Keane, I wanted to get your thoughts on the fact that he was a president who knew combat. As a young naval aviator, he knew combat, and reflect on what that means to have someone in the Oval Office who has answered the call of duty and has seen some of the most frightening things that any young service member could see.
No, certainly it had to have impact on him, and it was rare in the history of our presidents to actually have a war hero who is serving as a president. I think when I reflect on military duty, and one of the things that happens to you, and certainly he dealt with it during his 58 missions, is that fear and death are your silent companion. And as a result of it, it really informs the rest of your life. It has quite impact on you and the choices you make in your life. And so I'm confident that that experience that he had in dealing with fear and accepting his own fear and not being ashamed of it and facing it and also dealing with death all around him clearly impacted his life. And I think when we look at his lifelong achievements, we all respect that. But also, I think one of the reasons why he's beloved is how he chose to live his life. It's the kindness, humility, the strong moral compass. And I think an inner strength that he had that he didn't always reveal. But it clearly was there in his decisiveness about the use of military force and going into Panama to depose Noriega, a brilliant military campaign done at night, electrified even the military itself on how well that was done. And then, of course, a conventional war against Saddam Hussein's invasion into Kuwait, and he stitched together an incredible coalition that will always set a standard for future presidents. And recall he also sent troops into Somalia to deal with the famine relief. And that was successful in dealing with the famine relief. And then his successor made a decision to take on the SNLA militia, which I think was a mistake. And something else that people don't recognize and is forgotten is our troops had just come back from Desert Storm, and Hurricane Andrew took place in southern Florida, and it was a devastating level 5 hurricane. The damage was significant, and the local leaders were appealing for assistance, and President Bush said, let's get on down there with our best. And what we deployed was 18th Airborne Corps, which is the Army's premier fighting organization. Gary Luck was the Corps commander. I happen to be a brigadier chief of staff. We took with us the 82nd Airborne Division, 10th Mountain Division, tens of thousands of soldiers. He was very decisive in the use of military force. And also, you know, his personal courage is amazing to me. You know, when he skydived first time in his life at 75, he was not hooked up to anybody. The Army demonstration parachute team, the Golden Knights, which I'm very familiar with, based where they do so much at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I commanded. They trained him, and they were with him on the jump, but he was doing it himself. And then he came back at age 80 and did it again, and he started a tumble, and they both flew. Two soldiers flew to try to get him out of that tumble, and he kept tumbling and tumbling and tumbling, and clearly his life was being threatened at that point. And they stabilized him, and they said, Mr. President, when they got him on the ground, we're not going to permit you to do this by yourself anymore. The next time, if you want to do it, you're going to be hooked up to one of us.
Yeah, no service wants a former president expiring on their watch. You know, we sit here at this vantage point in history and we say, of course, the U.S. won World War II, but at the time he enlisted in the Navy to become its youngest pilot. That was not a foregone conclusion. This was just a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the early months of that war were not going well for the United States.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. You know the history of the United States military. With some exception, we usually get off on the wrong foot, to be quite frank about it. But we sort of figure it out pretty quickly, faster than our faster than our allies who are fighting the war with us, and that certainly happened there. But we were off on the wrong foot in Africa and also in the Pacific, but clearly it takes nothing away from the bravery. And for an 18-year-old to step forward like that, given his family history, he had college in front of him, going to a prestigious Ivy League school was the other option that he had, and he chose war at 18. And also we got to give his family enormous credit, you know, for supporting him in that endeavor. And then he steps on to the stage of war as the youngest pilot in the Navy, who eventually ascends to become President of the United States. That is a remarkable story.
You know, General Keane, as we look at these live images, this is what makes America great. We are giving him this honorable send-off that he has so greatly deserved. And as we look back at his life, it's interesting. Throughout the morning, over the weekend, you hear so many stories where some are remembered as politicians, great politicians. Some are remembered as great military men or great family men. He is being remembered for all three.
Yeah, I think the thing that actually comes forward more than anything else is the sheer character of the man. That is in everybody's words that are describing him, and certainly people that knew him very well and have shared experiences with him. It is in everybody's statement, and we're talking about somebody who lived an exemplary life, and we all admire people that carve out a life that he carved out for himself, and live that entire life and do it so selflessly and so thoughtfully in terms of other people. It is really an extraordinary life. And these troops that are here, I can tell you for a fact, they are so honored to be a part of this. They are our ceremonial troops out of the military district of Washington. And believe me, they are prepared to do every living president's funeral. They go through rehearsals for it. They go through it in certain details. But they are so honored to be out there standing guard and honoring our president here. It's a remarkable thing that they do. And there are ceremonial troops, and they're handpicked to be able to do what they're doing here, and also what they do routinely at Arlington National Cemetery, and also what they do routinely at the White House for state ceremonies.
The funeral procession should be just moments away from arriving there at Ellington Field, where, as you can see, the presidential aircraft Air Force One awaits. This will be Special Air Mission 41, as this big 747 flies the body of the late president and members of his family to Washington, D.C., where he will lie in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda.
President Bush served from 1989 to 1993. He died late Friday evening at the age of 94. And one particular image that we've been seeing throughout the morning is Sully the dog, his service dog, which, by the way, will be traveling with the casket on board Special Air Mission 41, that we're told. It was a very special picture, General Keane, because it does show the soft side of the president. That dog was very, very close to the president and always seen with him as he was in his wheelchair, and the service dog would often be along with him. And the spokesperson for the Bush family tweeted out that picture of the dog lying down next to the casket of Bush 41, and it was titled "Mission Complete."
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. You know, one of the things I admire about him, I dealt with his, you know, he had Parkinson's disease, and my Terry had it as well, you know, so I understand what he was going through. And I really respect and admire how he stayed a public figure, despite the torture of what that disease does to you, and what it does to your body. I mean, you lose control of it, to be frank. But he never lost control of his spirit. He never lost control of his affection for his fellow man. So you see him at towing courses and other ceremonies in a wheelchair, and you see his face, and you see what that disease is doing to him. But yet he's still out there. He's still out there among the people, and he's letting them see what this disease has done, how it's racked my body. But I'm still one of you. he wanted to be around all of that. I truly admire him for how he handled himself in the twilight of his life, being racked by a disease like that. He reminded me of Pope John Paul, who did very much the same thing, who dragged his body around and at church ceremonies, regardless of the torture of that disease.
Sully, the service dog, spent about 6 months, as I understand it, alongside President Bush as the motorcade arrives there at Ellington Field. Now, General, that service dog, Sully, is going to be given to another veteran, and that is going to be a special honor indeed.
Can you imagine that? What a wonderful thing that will be. That trooper will just cherish that experience. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great gesture in doing that.
Well, the Bush family is arriving via motorcade, traveling from the funeral home there in Houston, Texas, on its way to Ellington Field, where it's arriving now. The President Trump, just tweeting a moment ago, looking forward to being with the Bush family to pay my respects to President George H.W. Bush. We know that when the Bush family arrives there, that they will be joined by President and Mrs. George W. Bush on the tarmac. They are already awaiting the arrival of the rest of the family members there. They will then be escorted by Major General Howard. And the departure ceremony will then begin. It's expected to be brief, but this is the beginning of a very ceremonial several days that is about to happen to send off the 41st president.
I think when Barbara Bush died earlier this year, we all knew that it would not be long that George H.W. Bush would be on this earth, and sure enough, that turned out to be the case. Theirs was a remarkable union. 73 years they were married, the longest marriage of any presidential couple in U.S. history.
In his final hours, he was asked whether he wanted to go to the hospital. He had been to the hospital, as we know, multiple times leading up to this, and since his wife's death, that was April 17th. He'd been dealing with a number of health issues over the years, including, as General Keane is talking about, having a form of Parkinson's disease. But when the president was asked this time if he wanted to go to the hospital, his answer was no. He said he was ready to go on and be with Barbara, his wife of 73 years, and their late daughter, Robin, who died of leukemia as a child. And he will now go on a couple days from now to be buried next to both of them.
One of the pieces of legislation that he signed was the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and now as you see the pictures of him in his wheelchair in his latter months, there's a certain irony in that. The president who helped to make life better for so many Americans who are disabled himself in his last month, but as General Keane pointed out, just kept pressing on, kept making appearances, as he did at the Super Bowl in 2017, flipping the coin at the Super Bowl in Houston from his wheelchair. He was a man of great strength and continued to show that right up until the end of his days.
As we know, and as I mentioned, that the president had just tweeted that he was looking forward to being with the Bush family to pay respects to President George H.W. Bush. The 41st president will go to lie in state at the U.S. Capitol before a memorial service at the National Cathedral in Washington. A second memorial service then will take place at St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Houston. He will be getting around via Air Force One, which the president on his return from Buenos Aires had the Air Force One reset and sent down to Houston to collect the casket of Bush 41 for his final trip to Washington, and then he would return back to Texas. General Keane is still standing by with us as we see what will be a very emotional and honorable send-off by the U.S. military in just moments.
You know, Sandra?
Yes.
This is really fitting that he's going to be on this 747 because he was the first president to get that airplane and use it. He made the decision to take the other airplane and give it to the Ronald Reagan Library. I was told just earlier today that the choices were the Smithsonian Institute, the Air Force itself, and Boeing wanted it back. And the decision he made, thinking the amount of people that would actually see that airplane would be rather dramatic at the Reagan Library. And I was just out there at that forum where many people were this weekend seeing that airplane. I didn't realize the significance of what we're witnessing here today, that he was the first president actually used the 747 version of Air Force One, and that's what's taking him back to Washington D.C. That's quite amazing.
General, you spoke a moment ago about the honor being given to this Joint Military Honor Guard. Tell us a little bit about the members of this guard and who they are and how they come to that position.
Yes, well, the overwhelming number of them are young soldiers and airmen, seamen, and Marines, and they're in the ages of about 19 to 22. They all go through very special background checks. They're selected because of their military bearing. They all have very high IQs. They've already demonstrated early on a life of character. You're not going to ever have a problem with any of these soldiers. Our soldiers are just like other people in American life. They make mistakes as well, as young people do at that age. But this group of young people here, very few of them make mistakes because they're just they're the best we have. And then the sergeants who supervise them and the officers who are also part of this organization are all hand-picked for this assignment. And it's not something they do throughout their life. Obviously, they go to Iraq, they go to Afghanistan, they participate in deployments. But when you are assigned to this organization, these ceremonial units, you're full of pride in one, being selected is an honor in of itself. But then when you start to do these ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery for our fallen, or you're at a ceremony at the White House for an arriving head of state, or a state funeral as we're participating in here now, the honor and pride of that duty just washes over them. I mean, I can tell you for a fact that those soldiers, those troops we're looking at right now, as they see what's happening there, they are full of pride to be there and pay honor to this president.
Let's listen together.
special honored guests there on the ground at Ellington Field, saying goodbye to the extended Bush family as they board Air Force One for Special Air Mission 41, the flight that will carry the body of the former president, the 41st president of the United States, back to Washington, D.C. for the final time. He will lie in state there in the U.S. Capitol, and then a funeral service to take place at the National Cathedral. George W. Bush, the president's oldest child, was first aboard along with his wife, the former First Lady Laura Bush. One Bush sibling is missing, the oldest daughter, Robin, who died at the age of 4. Leukemia claiming the life of the former president's oldest daughter. It wasn't something that he talked about a great deal, but imagine the pain of losing a child at that young age. 17 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren also there, along with the 5 surviving Bush children.
The 41st president will be making his final trip to Washington, where he will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda from Monday, starting this evening, 7:30 p.m. until Wednesday, 8:45 a.m. His casket at that time would then be transported via motorcade Wednesday morning to the National Cathedral, where the state funeral will take place. That'll be 11 a.m. on Wednesday. President Trump, who just tweeted out that he is looking forward to being with the Bush family and to pay his final respects to President George H.W. Bush. He's ordered federal offices to be closed and a national day of mourning on Wednesday. He will be attending the funeral with the First Lady, Melania Trump. You're watching the Bush family. They've still been filing on board Air Force One today, Special Air Mission 41. Among those present there on the plane, his son Neil Bush, his 4th born, along with his wife Maria, his grandson George P. Bush also on board. And as we chatted about earlier, his beloved service dog, Sully, is waiting for him on that plane. He is going to see him off safely to Washington.
Those of you who love dogs know that Sully must be a little confused. He probably can sense that his master is there, might even be able to smell him, but he's not in the form that he remembers. And Sully, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be given to another veteran whom he will serve for, well, as long as he's able.
Let's listen for a minute. And as we talked about, Sully, the service dog, joining the former president on the plane as they depart for Washington. General Keane, retired 4-star general, you still are joining us here as we see the 41st president of the United States off to Washington, where he will lie in state for 2 days for the American public to pay their final respects and say goodbye to a president who is being remembered so fondly and honorably today, General.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that very special family that we have in America, the Bush family. They're all on that airplane together, you know, as they take the patriarch of their family back to Washington to be honored by the American people. What a real special family they truly are, and how well, regardless of what your politics are, how well all of them have represented this country. They certainly ought to be admired. It'd be great to see the American people respond to this. I think the lines are going to be long, and the people will be there out of respect, admiration, and also love, for this president. I'm going to be one of them, and I'm looking forward to paying honor to him.
George W. Bush, Bush 43, was the first one to board Air Force One. I'm not aware whether he's been on board that big 747 since he left office. After leaving office, the 747 generally flies the former president back to whatever home they will call home in their post-presidency. This might be his first return to Air Force One, and it's something that every president says they miss after they leave office. They miss Air Force One, and they miss the time aboard it, the places it takes them. Now he gets to travel with his father, who was the first president to fly on board that particular 747, to Washington, D.C. for one last flight, and what a remarkable moment in time this is.
General Keane, it's interesting to look back at his final years, his years as a retiree. He always had that hunger for adventure, and he's started skydiving, right? People said, "What are you doing?" They were taken aback by the fact that he wanted to do this, and he said, "Hey, old guys can still do this stuff," and it brings out the fact that old people can still do interesting things, scary things, exciting things, and that was really the George H.W. Bush that we saw in some of his final years, at least. He still wanted that thrill.
Yeah, I think he was demonstrating how much he celebrated life. He had enthusiasm for it. And it was pretty remarkable at that age to be doing something like that. And as I think his war years, those formative years where he had to deal with just terror at times and raw, stark fear that people in combat have to do, he became comfortable with that fear. He wasn't ashamed of it. And so here he was seeking to come to grips with it again at age 75. I mean, you're standing up on an airplane, you're skydiving for the first time, and you're 75 years of age. Believe me, the fear is washing over him. That, well, I can foul this up, and I may not make it. And all those things are going through his mind, but he goes out that plane anyway. Yeah, and that's only captured the imagination of the American people quite a bit, and then go right back and keep doing it every 5 years after that. Absolutely remarkable demonstration of how to deal with the twilight of your life.
General, as we await the departure here of Special Air Mission 41, what were your thoughts as you look back at that departure ceremony, honors rendered, simultaneous 21-gun salute? It's just got to be incredibly moving. It's moving for all Americans to see that, but a retired four-star general, as you see off our 41st president, what were your thoughts?
Well, I'm just like every other American out there. We have a very good man here who became president of the United States, and we've honored him. He was beloved, and I just felt so much pride for those troops that are standing there, knowing they wanted to get this perfect, and they did that, and out of respect for him, and they're doing their duty, and perfection is their duty, and they certainly stepped up to it, and seeing that entire family there certainly, I think, washes over all of us and reminds us just how much that entire family has done for this country. And it all got started, obviously, with this president and his marvelous wife, Barbara, as they set out on their life after the war was over and began their life in Texas. What a truly remarkable history it is. And that ceremony was done at perfection, and that's the way it should be. He was honored in that ceremony, and as he will be in the ceremonies to come. And I'm looking forward to seeing the American people step out into the Capitol to pay their respects to him.
Of course, it was a parachute that carried a young Navy pilot, George H.W. Bush, to safety when he was shot down at the age of 20, I believe. And that's what he resumed later in life after his presidency with those 4 jumps. General Jack Keane, General, it's good to have you on this morning. Thank you.
It was my honor. Thank you.
Rick Leventhal is at Ellington Field in Houston as they fire up the 4 engines on that big 747. Rick, some final observances today.
Well, it was an honor for us to be here as well, John, and I just want to mention some of the military that the general referenced included the 77th Army Band from Fort Sill, Oklahoma, who played ruffles and flourishes and hail to the chief. We heard and watched the 21-gun salute here along with members of the Bush family, and then we saw, as Sandra mentioned, the dog Sully was among those who will walk onto this plane after President George H.W. Bush's casket was removed by that Joint Military Honor Guard from the hearse and then carried to the waiting Air Force One, which is now, of course, Special Air Mission 41. The engines are up. The jet will begin taxiing shortly and then take off here from Ellington Field, the reserve base here at the joint installation hosting the Texas Air National Guard, but also obviously today hosting Air Force One and these dignitaries as they make their way back to Washington. A 3.5-hour flight, so they should be on the ground in D.C. sometime middle of this afternoon.
Engines are revving up now, and now, Rick, Special Air Mission 41 will make its way to Washington, D.C., where the former president will lie in state for a couple days there before Bush 41 makes his way back to Houston. Rick, final thoughts on the ground there as we're about to see the plane take off.
Well, it's remarkable the things that George H.W. Bush accomplished in his life, and so much that people may have forgotten about it, and so much that so many lives that he changed. And certainly here in Houston, he is very, very well respected and very well loved, and people have turned out, not just here at this airfield to see him off, but across the city laying flowers and paying their respects wherever they can. And of course, the president will be back here for a funeral for Texas loved ones and dignitaries before he's laid to rest in Texas next to his beloved wife Barbara. But just an incredible experience to be here and see the outpouring of love and support here on the ground, and to see the folks here come to see this man off, this great man off.
To quote the late president, the only thing about getting old, he said, is I want to be around to see the success in life. And at 94 years old, he passed on Friday, and he certainly saw a lot of successes in his lifetime, including his beloved wife, Barbara, his 6 children, 17 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren, some of which are there and some on board that plane right now to bid him farewell and travel back to Washington on what will be his final trip to Washington.
Still parachuting at the age of 90, a little more than 4 years ago when he turned 90, he made one of those tandem parachute jumps. And he observed afterwards, he said, just because you're an old guy, you don't have to sit around drooling in the corner. Get out and do something. Get out and enjoy life. And clearly he did that, living his life with zest and zeal right up to the very end.
The nation is watching now as we see Air Force One about to be wheels up and heading to Washington. The president and the first lady will be attending his funeral on Wednesday. And this will be a big several days of private and public viewings and ceremonies to pay final respects. This country looks on at our 41st president and remembers him so fondly for so many reasons, as a politician, as a military man, and as a beloved father who touched the lives of so many. And so many of the stories that we have heard today, talking to people who knew him so well, John, and worked so closely and so intimately with him, they remember him, and this struck me, as not only a wonderful man, a leader, but an inspiring, but tough. A lot of them use that word. He smiled a lot, but he was tough, and that inspiration that he had as a leader, as a father, it will have such a lasting impact on this country. And you saw that honorable send-off there on the ground. Interesting to hear the Army Band from Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It was a very moving ceremony in the beginning of several over the next couple of days.
That nickname, Gampy, that's what the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren That's how they knew him, and you get the sense that this was a very close family, and they are going to miss this man very much. But as has been pointed out, for them, this is not a day of sadness, not a time of sadness. This is a time to celebrate a life lived well, a life lived long, a life of great accomplishment and service to this nation.
And his service dog solely on board that plane with him, seeing him off safely to Washington. One other note, the family spokesperson today sending out a picture of the socks that he will be laid to rest wearing. He was a bit of a style fashion icon, if you will. He loved to wear some kind of fashionable loud socks at times. He became known for it, and the family made sure to let us all know that he will be wearing some special ones to be laid to rest today. A beautiful ceremony today, sending the former president off to Washington to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda, where he'll be for the next couple of days. Thank you so much for joining us live in America's Newsroom to see off the 41st president who passed away on Friday, and his departure ceremony from Houston. He's off to Washington, D.C. now. We will have continuing coverage on the Fox News channel. Please stay tuned right here for coverage of this story throughout the day. Thank you for joining us right here. I'm Sandra Smith in New York.
This has been a Fox News Special Report.